This show is brought to you by Safety FM.
Hi listeners, this is Brent Sutton. Welcome to episode 17 of the Practice of Learning Teams. This episode is going to be slightly different today. Hopefully the background music may give you some hint as to the country of origin of our very special guest. On today's show, we are joined by one of Canada's great sons of safety, Jeffery Lyth. Not only is Jeff a practitioner of the new view of safety, he's also the host of the Safety Differently Forum, and is very passionate about people and safety. I have to say that during the challenging times of 2020, meeting Jeff and getting to know him and his thoughts has been one of the highlights of that year. During the recording of the session with Jeff and my colleague and fellow author Glynis McCarthy, we covered a wide range of topics about learning teams. The content was so good, we have decided to make this a two-part series. In part one, Jeff shares his views on leadership thinking in the boardroom versus the front line, how learning teams completes the new view of safety, on how to prepare leaders for success with learning teams, the importance of creating a safe space for workers and leaders with learning teams, and lastly, how learning teams create transparency in the uncertainty of risk. During parts of this podcast, the tables were turned, and Glynis and myself were interviewed by Jeff about our thoughts on how learning teams are evolving, which was a wonderful experience and a welcome change. In part two, we will explore the future of learning teams with Jeffery Lyth. At the end of the part two episode, I'll then be joined by both Glynis and Brent Robinson, where we'll reflect on Jeff's discussion. Welcome, Jeff, to the podcast series.
Hi guys, thanks for having me.
Well, look, it's our pleasure, and look, I've been really keen to get you on the show for quite some time. Basically, for the listeners to hear about all the good things that you were doing in your neck of the woods.
What did we talk about? What did we say about overpromising? What did we say about that, Brent?
And of course, you've appeared a couple of times with Dr. Todd Conklin.
Correct.
And obviously, you're doing some amazing work in the whole sort of HOP and the learning team space. And I thought it was really valuable for the listeners to basically hear about how your journey started.
Happy to share. Yeah, absolutely. Happy to share whatever I can. It's all a work in progress. And I think the more our community stays together and shares and we have dialogue like this, the better. So like I say, really just honored to be here.
Hey, that's great. So how did it all come about, Jeff?
Well, I was born. No, I began my career in safety in around 92-ish, and hadn't really given safety a thought, and really hadn't by 92-ish. In fact, I had trained as a first aid attendant, and then when I was employed in that capacity, what they really wanted was prevention, compliance, and safety. And so, my career from then up until around 2010, to me, really matched kept pace with the evolution of safety management in the construction sector. In that, early on, there was a real cause and effect relationship between the things we did to improve safety and their obvious outcomes. But 20 years down that road, terrific career I'm so grateful for, and yet I couldn't really draw that line anymore. I was director of safety. I was administrator of a program over multiple work sites, but that cause and effect linkage, the benefit we were bringing was completely obscured to me, and some things started happening in the jurisdiction that again caused me to reflect on what we were doing in safety management. Somebody I had previously worked with was killed in an accident, and we had two very high profile explosions here in lumber mills in 2012. And so that was the huge, change point, I think, in my career, is that in 2012, after 20 years in conventional safety, I thought there had to be something more. Didn't know what it was, but I knew I wasn't going to find it staying where I was. And so on leap year 2012, I made the leap to step away from that position and take the risk of going into what at the time was uncharted waters. To me, it was uncharted waters. So once that change was made, I wasn't aware of any of this new view discussion or safety differently discussion or safety 2 discussion. And I began with bringing some leadership thinking, leadership ideas out to the front lines. I had the benefit of being a part of a lot of executive team discussions around leadership concepts and principles, and we'd talk about all that, and it was terrific. Learned so much in those sessions, but they were boardroom sessions. And so when I went out trying to, make a different kind of difference, one of the first things was to take, the best bits of that leadership discussion and take them out to frontline leaders who are out there, boots on the ground, where their leadership skills were really critically important. So it began there, and then very quickly I discovered safety differently, and then every all the time since then has been spent learning as much as possible and checking all the references, reading many references and citations, and going down all those rabbit holes, and just trying to grasp all of this information that's been coming online, the last 8 or 10 years.
Certainly there's a lot of information that's come about. So
Yeah.
How did your introduction to learning teams happen?
Well, for me, so began catching up, I think. Obviously, the new view is not new, right? So in 2012, I began catching up on, the lineage of all these ideas. And for me, learning teams really didn't come along until maybe 4 years ago. I'm guessing 3 or 4 years ago, it emerged. The concept emerged as a tool, and it just, I think it really was like, it was a real boost. It was really needed to complete the view we were having, or to certainly now I'm mostly interested in integration, hop integration, and exactly how we do that. And I think that learning teams is by far and away the most significant activity that happens on that journey.
Right, because do you think it sort of tries to help to humanize?
Well, I absolutely. But and it's the pre-work. It's that I believe very much that a really proper conceptual foundation has to be laid before we go there. At least that's my approach, is that we strive to ensure that we have so much dialogue around the concepts and the principles. And I think that when we if we're talking about an organization and we're talking about their senior leaders, managers, once we're at about maybe a 60% fluency rate or 60% buy-in, if you will, I think is the perfect time to coach them in having their first learning team in-house, because the results of that just really come back around and kind of prove the points in their own language, in their own terms, in their own house. And you'll know when we haven't sufficiently gotten to that point in the minds of the leaders. An organization has gone and conducted their first learning team, and when the results were brought back, the senior leadership team was really arguing with those results, and having a difficult time accepting that could be true, or what that was about. So there's a real indicator that not enough time was spent in the preparation, I think, to really tee that up for success. Because contrast that with the experience in some other orgs, that when you're at that, whatever ballpark 60% buy-in spot, and you convene a learning team and you come back and you table these results, and incredible response to people learning how much there is to learn in their own organization. And that's such a huge aha moment.
And I suppose sometimes you actually, well, I've actually seen like a physical awakening that occurs.
Mm,
You can actually physically
mm,
see the sudden shift, and like this little light bulb moment sort of gone off,
yeah,
and the
yeah,
neurons are flowing.
yeah.
You think
I think
that your
some really.
teams
Oh,
are
sorry, Glynis.
a validation kind of tool? That
I'm sorry.
could you say that the learning teams then are almost like a validation tool for how well HOP has been integrated?
I believe so. Yeah. Well, yeah. How well it's understood initially. I mean, over time, when more conducted, absolutely. But I think it's that first. We've been planting the seeds, and it's proof of concept that first time that, and people really do respond to it. Either I think intellectually because they're processing the rich context of their own operations, and sometimes I think people really respond more almost emotionally, in that we've had managers come and say, over the course of their career, they've had to take disciplinary action on people and do things that just never sat right with them. So whether it's a head or heart switch or both that is flicked. I think it's the preparation and the discussion, and then the evidence that can be brought to bear through that first learning team experience. And to me, that throws the door wide open to operational learning in all its forms, in all its sizes.
Yeah, I agree with you. It is a bit of a leap of faith at the beginning, isn't it? It's about people finding a voice and for that voice to be recognized. Um, I also think that, there has to be some maturity in the space. Yeah, for organizations to get the value from it, as well as those people participating in it.
In the learning team itself, yeah. Um, Creating the safe space. It's interesting too, though. It parallels to me that we have to make it safe for the executive to step away, however much from their tried and presumably true to them, tried and true means of doing what they do. It's incredibly vulnerable, and we need to make it safe for executives, not in a dissimilar way than we have to make it safe for participants on the team. Yeah.
Which really means that a facilitator becomes really important.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Cannot disagree. Yeah. And we found, the people that have really emerged as great facilitators, in many cases, wouldn't have been the individuals the organization would have chosen looking at their org chart. They're people that have gone through those foundational sessions and resonated and then participated and added to the discussion. They're willing, they get it, they're inspired by it. And those people I found really go on. Those that are still, needing something more mechanical or more of a step-by-step prescribed approach, struggle, and lots of coaching is needed there.
And I think that's reflective that everyone's learning journey is different.
Right.
And that, we're trying to build these soft skills for people, and not everyone has those soft skills.
So yes, agreed. It's interesting. The part of the HOP integration journey, of which learning teams come along as a huge part, fairly early in the process, but it changes the job for senior managers and their caution around it. Is well founded to them, I think. I mean, we're saying blaming is so convenient and simple. It's very efficient and at doing what they think it does. And when we switch here, their job changes. Their job just used to be to dole out the discipline and ensure the investigation and some corrective actions are done, and do a stand down where they stand and bark at people, and then back to work. You barely have to leave your desk other than for the stand down. And so when we start talking now about these rich contextual antecedents to behavior, what that feels like to them is well, I've heard them say it's giving the asylum over to the inmates or what have you, which I think is horrible. But it changes the job of management. Now you've got all this context to manage. You can't just assume that all these contextual influences over the work are perfect. And that's, I think it's burdensome, I think, on some managers. It feels like liability that they're if they absolve workers, then they're taking it all on themselves. And so we really have to navigate that what we're unearthing, I think, when we unpack this context is in such detail that I don't know that what we unearth necessarily is some big red flag waving bit of negligence or oversight or violation or something. It's quite often in the details. So, but it really does change the job of management for some, and there are those that embrace that change and evolve into the sort of the new century, or those that will resist. And I fear for them because times are moving and changing and evolving, and some managers have got their whole career invested in getting where they are. And I'm afraid that if they are unable to evolve, it's almost a career limiting stance to take.
And we believe the market is changing, and that as the world looks sort of post-pandemic, that organizations start to move into that whole sort of recovery mode, and a lot of questions start to be asked around how do we optimize safety? How does safety bring value to the organization? How do we get rid of some of the waste that we've accumulated over this period of time?
Right. It's an amazing opportunity how well, for the most part, how well many organizations have been able to do in the absence of a plan and dealing with things that are emerging and being very fluid and adaptable. What organizations have realized about the strength, the amazingness of their people, when their people come together in times like these and pull together and in many cases have to go off script or black line and really make things work. This has been such an experience that I hope, beyond hope, that we can keep some of these points going for us into the next year, and that we become less rigidly fixed on plans and rigid plans, and we think more of our people. We've seen greatness in people come out in these times, and we've seen that things go well if we're adaptable and fluid and thinking fast. I mean, it's been a bit tiring, right? But I think the benefits of having been through this experience hopefully carry on.
But we also want people to feel psychologically safe as well. Not just that they feel that they're physically safe, but they're also psychologically safe. And I think things like COVID-19 has really affected people's own self component in that. And what we're seeing is that learning teams are really a great way of being able to bring that out and help to normalize that at the same time, because they're hearing from others about similar journeys. This thing that they've internalized, they're now able to externalize and hear that other people, and they're also hearing that the people that supervise them or the people that manage them are just as human as well.
So can I ask a question back in this discussion of ours?
Of course you can.
So organizations themselves and the people at the top of organizations, there's so much noise in the safety space about really criminalizing the organization and vis-a-vis perhaps the people at the head of the organization. So the internalization of that criminalization, if you will, and passing it down the organizational chart. What are your thoughts on affecting that? Because I think that's one of the things that creates the hurdles that we then have to come across, is that the simplest thing for those senior leaders to do is pass down this punitive, strict liability type of approach. And in that worldview, the old way makes perfect sense. So what are your thoughts on communicating with senior leaders when they themselves face criminalization and we're saying, don't internalize and pass on that punitive, retributive kind of view?
Well, look, the reality is that the criminal code that exists for breaches of health and safety is based on that. It is based on blame. It's based on retribution.
Mhm.
There is a victim, a person who gets hurt, and there is a perpetrator, the party that causes hurt. That never changes. I think what's different here is that when the event happens and when the regulator becomes involved, the regulator is looking to identify the difference between blue line, black line. That they prey on the difference between work as imagined and work as done. And that's the entire focus. So what we talk about is that if that gap between work as imagined and work as done starts to widen over time, and that gap starts to shift from being a gap to a chasm, then that chasm is the liability you're going to face when the event occurs. So what a learning team is really good at doing is it's basically good at trying to allow that gap not to become a chasm. Because risk has to ebb and flow through the organization and through the supply chain and the contract chain. So, and no matter what happens, there's always going to be a gap. The difference is you can step over a gap and manage the risk with it. With a chasm, you fall through it. And in my 18 years of dealing in human misery, okay to focus on culpability. Okay, it's okay, because it's a form of risk management. But at the end of the day, all the ugliness comes out when something goes wrong. Learning team helps to really reduce that level of ugliness that comes about in that way. And every country has different jurisdiction, applies different rules and logic, but you know the regulator is looking for that gap or that chasm.
Well said, Brent. Thank you.
Hopefully that's helpful.
Well, we've had as a guest Brent Sutton on Jeff's podcast today. No, I think I completely agree. That makes perfect sense. You know, I think that regulators take that approach with organizations because they're external, and it's really probably all they can do for the most part. But that said, I completely agree and really support these alternatives to enforcement that we're talking about these days. You know, at all levels of regulatory enforcement. But inside an organization, I mean, there's no need to internalize those constructs that maybe have to exist out in society as a whole, in our houses, in our cultures. You know, we can avail ourselves of so many more tools than simply, you know, hierarchical command and control and authority and discipline, right? Like that's really where I think we've erred, or what's made sense for the last however many years is that's how safety works, right? We count it in insurance metrics and we achieve it through enforcement just like the regulator does. And yet under our roofs, we have a world of options beyond that.
Look, we do. And, you know, the reality is that behavior is driven through fear. Fear is driven through uncertainty. And uncertainty is driven by not understanding what value your safety brings to both the organization and to workers, because it's only workers who are exposed to residual risk.
Right.
Workers don't really give a shit whether you give risk a number, a color, or a label. It's meaningless.
Yeah.
So they're the only people exposed to it. The organization is exposed to liability if they don't get that residual risk right.
Right.
I think, you know, learning teams has that power of creating that transparency for people to then understand what that uncertainty is, and for them to have a plan then to how to reduce that uncertainty over time.
And would you agree that the laying a good foundation, I mean, before, you know, embarking on the learning team part of the journey, but what we were speaking of earlier about that laying those foundations in an effective way, in your experience, is that as critical to you as it feels like to me?
Look, it is from the point of view of trying to normalize it with managers that they're going to feel different things at different times. and that they are equally as an important part of the journey as others. But what they're going to see and what others are going to see is they're going to see things through the lens of other people for once in their life. And looking at life through a different lens is not comfortable.
Right.
So our job is to basically provide that psychological safety for them as well,
Right.
for that same coaching and mentoring. And the best way to do that is to normalize it.
I think there's also a difference between a one-off event, so doing a learning team as a one-off over a particular topic or area of business, versus something that's sustained into practice. I think if it's something that is sustained into ongoing practice, then it does need to have a different approach. You know, you need to have a certain maturity within the organisation. You need to have a certain skill level in the organisation. There kind of have to be some ground rules that have been decided that everybody plays to. And so I think that that's a different proposition than when you're using a learning team to solve a particular issue or to explore an issue in more depth.
Yeah, good, excellent point. I mean, most of the work I do is about help. Evolution is a term that we use, just helping organizations evolve their practice of safety. So very interested in that long-term piece, and to that end, spend a lot of time at the front end, sort of preparing the organization for that, so that operational learning in all its forms and degrees really continues and becomes the new normal. I'm sad when you do some work and we go in and we can create that psychological safety and we can convene a learning team in an effective way. But when those results are argued with, when the organization argues with the reality of those results and is still troubled, it's, to me, it's a lot of prep. We were on the cusp of great change and we didn't quite get there. So I'm really cautious about that, a one of. Because for that reason, my interest is the work I do is not really helping organizations with one learning team. It's creating change, a lasting change in the organization.
Certainly what we've seen, Jeff, and how we have sort of evolved our learning teams is to make sure that when the organization gets that feedback, that there's three parts to that feedback. There's that, what did the organization learn through that learning team? What did workers learn from that learning team? And what did the facilitator learn? Because they're all quite different things.
Absolutely.
And I think sometimes what organizations do is they struggle to contextualize the context of how it was said. And hence the reason why that when we, in the book, The Practice of Learning Teams, we put that spin model in the book as a way of contextualizing that conversation, that many managers are used to having to fix things. And their decision making is based on things that they're thinking about. But if we could break that down so that they could get better understanding of the situation that workers in the organization was facing, what problem did that situation give from an organization and a work perspective, what's the implication for both workers and organizations if we don't change it, and then what's the need? And I think I know it sounds completely basic, but just being able to show that little journey on an A4 or a US letter, what we've found is it's given people huge context, and they sit there and they go, wow,
yeah,
now we understand. If we give them an output, a single output, they're then saying, what do you mean by this? Why do people think that? Makes sense? And this is the struggle. So we need to paint the story as much, because a learning team is about capturing the stories. How do we paint the story at the other end?
Yeah, excellent. Yeah. I think based on that, it's organizations that allow this process to take place, but they're really not ready to learn this way. And so they're going to, those organizational learnings are going to be denied. I think facilitators probably almost always learn if they're reflecting on their practice. And I hope Worker learnings is interesting. We had a terrific experience in an organization that was pretty labor relations tense, shall we say? And we were meeting with the highest level of unionized workforce and the lowest level of the managerial workforce, and through the process, it wasn't a formal learning team as such. It was some workshopping, though, that was very dialogic and inclusive and practice some of the same things. But a profound learning that came away there was what the various stakeholders had in common, and not their differences. And I reflected on that and thought that almost any other approach to that organization and that piece of work would have hunkered down behind those divisions and really what we experienced was this empathy for the other side, if you will, really an understanding and an appreciation. And so what emerged from that was different ways of working together. What was formerly adversarial and contentious, they found common ground through the process of going through this. So I completely agree. Organizational learning, worker learning, and facilitator learning are key.
Yeah, and being able to express that and acknowledge that and then work with that, all those things become important in that process.
Yeah.
Please join us for part 2 of this podcast called episode 19, where we continue the conversation with Jeff and we explore the future of learning teams. Thank you, listeners, for being part of this podcast. We'd love to hear your learnings from today or other topics you would like us to support you on. Go to www.podcastlearnings.com and be part of the community practice of learning teams at www.learningteamscommunity.com.
The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the host and its guest and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the company. Examples of analysis discussed within this podcast are only examples. They should not be utilized in the real world as the only solution available, as they are based only on very limited and dated open source information. Assumptions made within this analysis are not reflective of the position of the company. No part of this podcast may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means, mechanical, electronic, recording, or otherwise, without prior written permission of the creator of the podcast, Jay Allen.